Molly from Oahu by Elizabeth Sears. Taken from the book Courageous Girls. Anne Ballard stood on the deck of the great trans-Pacific liner Coltonia and looked down upon the multi crowd on the wharf below her. In spite of the discontent that filled her mind, the girl could not help being interested as she took her last look at Honolulu. Already the gangplanks were up, and the Royal Hawaiian Band, standing in the midst of the crowd on the deck, were sending forth the sweetly mournful note of aloha. The brisk shower of 5 minutes before had cleared away with tropical sadness. The sun shone down hotly on the animated scene. Groups of native Kanakas in their highly colored, stiffly starched holokas wept and laughed by turns, as quick to change as the uncertain weather. Pretty Ellie girls and their garlands of brightly colored and heavily scented flowers, which by the charming native custom are hung on the shoulders of the departing friends, pushed their way to the edge of the wharf, carrying their long bands of flowers over their arms carelessly. Now and all the passengers were on board, and sales for the day ended. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and Portuguese added happy hues to the throng, contrasting sharply with the dull khaki regimentals of the many American officers and soldiers who were scattered through the crowd. Just below Anne, in a dazzle of smart white gowns and uniforms, stood Mrs. Whiteman and her daughters chatting to a group of officers. Anne's eyes filled with angry tears to think that they should be staying with all that was interesting and fascinating here, while she must go. At that moment she felt impatient with the delay in starting. The weight of the flower garland with which her friend had loaded her shoulders seemed almost unbearable in the hot sun, and she turned away almost petulantly from her father, who stood at the rail beside her. A passing stewardess was handing out rolls of ribbon confetti, and following the example of those around her, Anne threw some to her friends on the wharf. In a moment the great liner seemed fastened to the dock with 1,000 tiny streamers of red, blue, pink, and yellow and green. The crowd below responded happily and surged forward for the last greetings as the great boat pulled away so slowly that those on her decks felt no motion. Suddenly, everyone began to wave, although the steamer had moved but a few feet. Handkerchiefs, hats, flowers fluttered in the bright sunlight. Anne, catching the spirit of excitement, tore a lei of violets from her neck and tossed it to Dorothy Whiteman, who caught it with a smile and put it on. For the next few moments garlands of flowers flew through the air. Roses, violets, hydrangeas, bougainvilleas dropped to the wharf below. The crowds shouted last remarks, and notes of the band swelled above the din. The slender strips of colored paper stretched and broke, and the great liner turned her nose out of the harbor towards the sea. Anne's visit to Honolulu and Oahu was a thing of the past. When her father had suggested that she should spend her summer going to the islands with him, Anne had been only mildly interested. She liked to travel with her father, but the Hawaiian Islands were just vague spots in an almost forgotten geography book, as far as she was concerned. Mr. Ballard had business with the great sugar plantations of Oahu, which demanded that he should make the trip, and he always planned to be with Anne during her vacations. Then Dorothy Whiteman had said that she and her mother and sister were going out after they had been to the fair in San Francisco, and she had enthused so on the subject that Anne had decided that she was very fortunate to be going too. But she could not guess how reluctant she would be to leave. For while her father was all away at the plantations and on the trips to the other islands, Anne had stayed with the Whitemans, and she had enjoyed every moment. She loved the great mountains covered with strange tropical trees and shrubs, rising straight out of the sapphire blue sea. She loved the warm, languid days and the gorgeous moonlight nights, when she and her friends danced out of doors and took a dip in the ocean before going to sleep. And now to think that the Whitemans would be living in the sunlight of Oahu and doing all these beautiful, delightful things, while she should be shut up in a schoolroom in New York and probably surrounded by snow. She had felt so sure that her father would let her stay when the Whitemans had decided to spend the winter, that she had not made any reservations for herself on the Cultonia as her father had directed. And so when Mr. Ballard had come back the day before the ship sailed and had insisted that she was to return with him, she had to take what accommodation she could get, and the result was a small inside room which she had to share with a roommate, and had never traveled that way, and the prospect did not add to her good humor. But for once her father had been firm. He was sure that she would always regret it if she did not finish with her class at school. As Anne went below decks to her room, she was in a very bad mood, for a usually sweet-tempered girl. She had been cross to her father, and she knew that she had hurt his feelings, which made her unhappy. For Anne loved her father, who was her only relative, better than anyone else in the world, and she appreciated all that he did for her. So now, as she looked through the maze of passageways for her own room, Anne decided that she would get her things in order and brace up before luncheon. She found the right number at last and opened the door. There stood a strange girl in black, bending over a steam truck. Anne drew back with a word of apology. She had forgotten the roommate another grievance. But Molly Upton, as the girl in black introduced herself, had such a pleasant sun-browned face and bright, interested eyes that Anne promptly made up her mind to stay and talk for a while. Before they were out of the bay, Anne found herself telling her troubles to an unexpectedly sympathetic listener, seated on the edge of her upper berth, her feet swinging and feeling better for her burst of confidence. Anne lazily watched the other girl busy with her belongings. "I hate to miss seeing the harbor for the last time," Molly said wistfully, as she deftly unpacked. "But I don't dare to wait until we are at sea to get out the things I want." "Are you such a bad sailor?" Anne asked apprehensively. "I really do not know," Molly replied frankly. "I was so small when I came out to Oahu that I can't remember." And then it came out that Molly's father, who had been a bookkeeper at one of the big sugar plantations, had died a few months before and left Molly alone. She was now going to a married brother who had a farm in the States. As she had not seen him since she was a small child and had never met his wife, she was not very happy in the prospect. "I wish I had your chance to go to school," the girl finished longingly. "You see, I wanted to be a teacher, and I have not finished school, and I'm afraid that I never can now, for my brother is poor, and I shall have to help at the home to earn my way." Anne sat very still while Molly was talking. She gradually felt a good deal ashamed that she had poured out her grievances to a girl who had such problems of her own. In fact, her own troubles seemed to dwindle as Molly talked and unpacked garments which to Anne were painfully plain. There seemed very little to say when Molly had finished her story, but Anne wanted to do something to show her interest. So she offered to take Molly's ticket to her father and ask him to get the girl a seat at the same table with them. Mr. Ballard was only too glad to do anything he could for the young girl traveling alone, whose story Anne poured into his sympathetic ears. He had not made any comment on Anne's behavior, but he had noticed, of course, how unhappy she had been at leaving Honolulu, and he felt very much relieved that She came to him cheerfully and with this errand. Fortunately, Molly turned out to be an excellent sailor, and the two girls became very good friends in the bright, clear days that followed. They walked miles around the decks, played shuffleboard together, and lay in their steamer chairs side by side for hours at a time. Molly, who, since her coming, had never been off her island, was eager to learn of ships' ways, and was never tired of hearing tales of Anne's life in the city. Anne showed all her pretty clothes and dainty traveling things to her roommate, and Molly admired everything ardently. The result was that Anne quite unconsciously patronized her new friend a little. Her attitude toward her was kindly, but it was a bit condescending. Molly knew so little about things that made Anne's life that it never occurred to Anne that she might know about anything else. And after that first day's talk, Molly rarely mentioned her own affairs. And so 4 days of the trip passed, and they began to feel they were nearing San Francisco. The voyage would be over in a couple of days, and both girls were sorry. Anne could not get up a bit of enthusiasm about going back to school, although she had not said so since the first day out, and Molly dreaded the end of her journey and the beginning of her new life. The two girls, each busy with her own thoughts, were unusually silent as they walked the deck before dinner and finally paused to lean on the rail and watch the flaming crimson sunset. A few clouds hung low in the west. The rest of the sky was as clear as the ocean, which stretched calmly and unruffled as far as the darkening horizon. It was so peaceful and quiet that they hated to leave when the bugle announced dinner, but their good, healthy sea appetites demanded immediate attention. Much of their surprise when they came back to the deck, they found that the weather had changed and that there had run into a fine, drizzling rain. Stewards were busy everywhere getting up awnings, but in spite of their haste, the deck was spoiled for the usual evening dance. Anne and Molly went up to the hurricane deck, where the Hawaiian orchestra, their coat collars turned up about their ears, were playing with what enthusiasm they could muster. The girls curled up in their steamer chairs in the lee of a big lifeboat and pulled their rugs snugly about them. But it was chilly and damp, and no one seemed to feel very cheerful. The tropics were now surely left behind. Suddenly the foghorn boomed out its dreary warning. "Oh dear," sighed Anne. "I hope that thing will not be going all night." The hour was still early when the two girls decided to go below to bed. The ship was running through a very heavy fog, and it was poor fun on the deck. Anne was soon asleep, but Molly was not used enough to ship's ways to take the foghorn so calmly. It seemed to her a dreadful sound, and she wondered how Anne could sleep. Then she began to think of the end of her journey, to speculate about it, and after that, the harder she tried to go to sleep, the more actively her mind worked. Hour after hour passed. It seemed as if she had never been so wide awake. Suddenly Molly sat upright in her berth. A curious, slow quiver had seemed to run from bow to stern of the boat. It was not like anything she had ever felt before, but it was terrifying. Very still and tense, she sat and waited, but nothing further happened. She wondered if, after all, she had been asleep. Anne had not moved, so she forced herself to lie down again, and was settling herself among her pillows when, without warning, the throb of all the engines and the roar of the foghorn stopped. The silence was much more startling than any noise could have been. It seemed as if the great ship had ceased to live in that moment. With a hand that trembled a little, Molly reached for the light. Twice she snapped the switch in vain. Something had happened to the electricity. Anne stirred in the berth above her. "What's the matter?" she asked sleepily. "I don't know," Molly answered. Her voice, though calm, was a little husky. "But I think we'd better get up and dress." Where's the electric torch of yours? I can't turn on the lights." Anne came over to the edge of her berth. Instantly, she was trembling with fright and chill. Neither girl could see a thing. The room was absolutely dark and damp with the fog which came from their one small, grated port that gave upon a deck. As Anne fumbled among her things, the boat rolled sidewise with appalling slowness, so that her steamer trunk came sliding out from under the berth. "Let's get out of here," Anne cried, grabbing a coat. "Never mind the light," and she stumbled in the dark towards the door. Molly knelt on the floor. She thought that she remembered seeing the light in it the day before. Close beside her, Anne struggled with the door. "Molly," she gasped, "did you lock this?" "Why, no," answered Molly. "You told me never to lock a door on board ship. Ah, here's the light." Never had anything seemed so wonderful as that tiny flare. By its feeble light, Molly could see Anne's white, stricken face turned towards her. "What?" she began, voicing the fear that she read there. "The door," Anne whispered with dry lips. "I'm afraid it's jammed." Molly laid the light on a berth, and both girls, without a word, pulled with all their strength on the resisting door. It would not give in the slightest degree. The room stayed at its fearful sideways slant, and everything was still, horribly still. They did not even hear steps on the deck above them. Terrible thoughts entered the girls' minds as they stood there shivering and helpless. Anne began to cry hysterically. "We shall be drowned like rats," she sobbed. "No, we will not," Molly answered, with a sureness which she did not feel. "Your father will get here somehow. That door will have to be opened from the other side. We must get dressed." Anne braced herself before Molly's calmness. The shy little island girl had suddenly become the leader. The moments passed like hours, while, with clumsy fingers, the girls hurried into their clothes. What had happened? Were they cut off from help? Could Mr. Ballard get to them? His shout from the passageway sent them flying to the door, calling out their predicament. With a couple of stewards to help, the door finally gave way. Closely and silently the girls clung to him and went with him up the strangely sloped passageway to the upper deck. Here, a few lanterns and handlights showed the passengers huddled in silent groups, clad in first clothes they had come to hand, and waiting patiently to be told what to do by the officers who were directing the loading of the lifeboats. Molly had a dazed feeling that it was not at all as she would expect such a scene to be. A few women were sobbing softly, but there was little noise and no confusion. In a moment she and Anne were being put into a lifeboat, side by side, by Anne's father. He leaned over and kissed his daughter, and then was swallowed by the fog as their lifeboat slipped out and down. The night was so black that they could not see the water below them, but it seemed a fearfully long way off. Then suddenly something gave way. One end of the boat pitched downward, while the other stayed still, and almost there they knew what had happened. Both girls were dropping into the sea. Anne clung to Molly. She forgot where she was or why she clung. Fear overcame her utterly. She heard Molly's voice in her own ear, pleading with her to let go, that she would drown them both. But the words had no meaning. She was beyond the power of reason. Down, down they went into the black, cold water. Molly's strong arms, which had pushed her away through miles of the Pacific ever since she was a child, were helpless now in the stranglehold of her friend. In vain she strained, in vain she pulled. The heavy coats which both she and her friend wore helped to drag them down. Molly held her breath from long practice. If she could only get one arm free. Then suddenly Anne's arms dropped from their mad embrace as if by magic. The girl had fainted. With one hand Molly caught her friend as she slipped from her and instantly slid out of her coat. The next moment she was breathing on the surface. Molly was not afraid now. She had not played in the water for hours at a time for nothing. Quickly she got Anne out of her coat and then laid the unconscious girl across her feet for a few moments while she swam on her back and tried to look around her. But although the water was unusually calm, she could not see the ship or any of the boats. A blanket of fog had closed down upon her. For some time she floated and swam and managed very well, supporting her unconscious companion first in one way and then in another. But even such strength and endurance as hers could not hold out for very long with such burden. It was soon hard work to keep her friend's head above water. Molly tried every trick that she had learned from a race famous the world over for its swimming. But after a while she realized that her friend was failing. Most of all, she struggled to keep her calmness. Once that was gone, she knew that she was lost. It never occurred to her to abandon Anne, although without her, Molly could have kept herself afloat for hours. Her lungs seemed ready to burst with the effort she was making, and her mind began to skip moments and to seem to stand outside of herself, as if it were someone else working in the water. And then she heard a sound. It was the chug-chug of a launch so close behind her that it seemed as if someone must see her, even though it was foggy. She made a tremendous effort to call out, but only a faint sound came from her lips. She could see nothing, but she heard a man's voice say, "Stop that engine, now! A few feet to port," and she knew no more. When Molly woke again, it was in a cabin very much like the one she and Anne had occupied on the ill-fated Cultonia. There was Anne on the couch opposite her, lying quite still, but with her wide open eyes fixed upon her eagerly. "Oh, Molly," she cried, "I had begun to think that you were never going to wake up. How do you feel?" "I didn't dream it then," answered Molly, stretching her aching limbs carefully. "Goodness, how stiff I am!" At this moment a stewardess, a ship's doctor, appeared in the doorway, and at once Molly found herself swallowing hot broth. "What happened?" she asked the doctor between sips. "Mustn't talk," he answered authoritatively. "You're on the moorland now. The Calotonia struck a derelict in the fog, but we heard her SOS in time, and everyone was saved, even those dropped out of the lifeboat with you. Now go to sleep." Molly was very comfortably sleepy, but she looked at Anne for more information. "How are you, Anne?" she asked. "Oh, I'm all right, thanks to you," Anne answered. "I don't understand a thing after we got into the water, but you kept me from drowning for almost half an hour. I think Father said. I don't know how you did it. Father says it's wonderful. He's just waiting for you to wake up to tell you what he thinks of you. He's grateful beyond words. I'm all he has, you know, and he wants to do something for you. Molly, if you'll only go to school with me, it would be perfect. As for me, well, you saved my life, Molly, such as it is. I've been lying here all day looking at you and thinking how fine you are and how quite quiet and modest, and I'm just ashamed of the way I—" Here Anne stopped suddenly, for Molly was fast asleep. "Oh, dear," Anne whispered to herself as she leaned back against her pillow. "All that to say again tomorrow, but maybe I can do better next time. Anyway, before she wakes up, I can think of any amount of nice things that we are going to do together. Maybe we'll even go back to Oahu someday. Yes, there's plenty for me to think of while she sleeps. It seems to have needed a terrible experience like this to make me appreciate a number of things." The end.